The sun hung lazily over St. Mary Mead, spilling its late summer warmth across the green, where the annual church garden fete was in full bloom. A gentle hum of chatter and laughter drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of scones and rose water. The bunting, freshly laundered and fluttering in patriotic shades, danced cheerfully along the hedgerows. To any casual observer, it was a perfect English afternoon, harmless, genteel, and utterly uneventful. Except, of course, that in St. Mary Mead, perfection was a fragile illusion. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably behind the jam stall, an honor she never refused, though she found the competition over preserves rather unbecoming, observed the scene with her usual mild expression. Her knitting needles clicked softly on her lap, an innocent accompaniment to the symphony of gossip that surrounded her. "Have you heard, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Dolly Bantry whispered, leaning in conspiratorially. "The new owners of Candlelight Farm are American. Just imagine, Americans buying a Georgian farmhouse. They've already redecorated the drawing room in turquoise." Miss Marple nodded pleasantly. "Americans are very fond of turquoise," she replied. "It reminds one of the sea. Quite modern, really." Mrs. Bantry looked both horrified and thrilled. "Yes, but that's not all. I heard they're planning a film, some sort of documentary, I think, about village life. Fancy that, St. Mary Mead on the silver screen." A film crew in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. How very interesting. Across the green, the new residents of Candlelight Farm were indeed the center of attention. Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, he a tall, silver-haired man with a polished American confidence, she a striking woman with the air of someone accustomed to being looked at, had taken up residence barely a fortnight ago. Their presence had stirred the village like a spoon in hot tea. The Fate's grand raffle was announced, and Mr. Harrington strode to the podium, smiling broadly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his accent crisp and charming, "my wife and I are honored to sponsor this year's prize. A weekend stay at Candlelight Farm, complete with dinner and champagne. We do hope it'll give one lucky villager a taste of the countryside we've fallen in love with." A ripple of delight swept through the crowd, though a few skeptical looks were exchanged. Such extravagance was not the English way. As the tickets were drawn, Miss Marple's eyes wandered, not to the Harringtons, but to a young woman standing apart from the crowd, her face pale beneath her straw hat. She was the vicar's niece, Miss Alice Denham, a quiet girl, more often found in the church vestry than at public gatherings. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her raffle ticket, and her gaze lingered on Mrs. Harrington with an intensity that did not match the occasion's cheer. Moments later, the vicar's wife announced the winner. "Oh, how delightful, Miss Alice Denham." There was polite applause, a few good-natured cheers. Mrs. Harrington herself stepped forward, beaming, and pressed the invitation envelope into Alice's hand. "We'll expect you Saturday evening, my dear. Bring an appetite." Miss Marple, from her corner, noted the curious absence of joy on the girl's face. Instead, there was a flicker of dread, swift but unmistakable. And so it was that a simple garden fete, fragrant with roses and laughter, became the prelude to something dark. 3 days later, when the bells of St. Mary Mead tolled the hour of 8, Alice Denham was found dead at Candlelight Farm. Morning in St. Mary Mead arrived with a thin, milky sun and the sort of chilly brightness that made the hedges look newly scrubbed. By 7:30, there were already 2 versions of events circulating through the village, each as tidy and confidently arranged as a well-laid tea tray. Mrs. Price Ridley declared at the grocer's that poor Alice had been taken ill at Candlelight Farm and that Americans, however generous, did not understand English digestion. At the post office, however, Mr. Thomas swore he had it from the maid at the farm, relayed via her cousin's fiancé, which was practically a notarized affidavit, that the girl had been found in the turquoise drawing-room, collapsed by the mantel, pale as the china dogs upon it. At 8:15, Dolly Bantry appeared at Miss Marple's gate with a brisk rap that carried a plea for company. "They say it was poison," Dolly announced, once she had been coaxed into the sitting room and supplied with hot buttered toast. Nothing dramatic, of course. A faint, then nothing. Dr. Haydock's been and gone, so quiet one might almost have missed it, like a teacup cracking when no one is listening. Miss Marple, who was always listening, threaded her knitting needles and regarded Dolly with mild interest. "Poison is considered quiet," she mused. "People think of it as feminine. That is a mistake. It is merely economical." Dolly's eyes brightened. "Economical of what?" "Of effort," Miss Marple said. "And of noise." She glanced at the little clock on the mantel. "They said the church bells were striking 8?" "So I heard." She was due to arrive for dinner at 7:30. An invitation the whole village knew about, thanks to that wretched raffle. The Harringtons like a flourish. Lights in the windows, a gramophone perhaps, that sort of thing. She went, apparently cheerful, Dolly added doubtfully. And then, well, have you noticed, Jane, how rarely things end as they are staged to begin? Miss Marple had noticed. She had also noticed the envelope in Alice's hand at the fete, and the girl's tremor, and the way Mrs. Harrington had pressed the invitation upon her, as one might press a gift into a child's hand who doesn't want it. She did not say these things. Instead, she said, "Have they notified the vicar?" "Oh, yes. Griselda's distraught. Alice had been staying with them these past months, you know, something about wanting quiet to finish a series of watercolors. I always thought the vestry a drafty place to set up one's paints, but youth makes a virtue of discomfort. Griselda says Alice had a headache yesterday afternoon and did not intend to stay long at the farm." Dolly hesitated. "Jane, there's talk of an American film. Do you suppose there could be a connection? People become ambitious when a camera points at them. It makes them do things." "Ambition is an old poison," Miss Marple said gently. "Cameras simply make it fashionable." By 10, the lanes had begun their quiet procession of purposeful strollers, those who had happened to be passing Candlelight Farm. The house itself sat in honeyed stone above an orchard, the new paint on its window frames too bright for the lane's taste. A police motor car, ill at ease amid the hedgerows, was angled in the drive. Constable Polk stood at the gate with his thumbs in his belt and an expression of professional gravity. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," he said as the two ladies approached. He was always ceremonious with Miss Marple, respect born of repeated experience. "I'd advise folks to keep on. Inspector slack from the county is expected." "That would be wise," Miss Marple agreed, with a glance that took in the drive, the gravel's disturbed crescents, and a small smear of something pale against the bottom rail of the gate. Putty or wax, she thought, though perhaps it was only clay from the garden path. "We thought to call on Mrs. Harrington later. Griselda sends her sympathies." Polk nodded, relieved to deliver a message. "Mrs. Harrington's very cut up. It was she who found the young lady, in the drawing-room like people said. They'd rung the bell for dinner at 7:30, but Miss Denham asked for a glass of water first. Headache, they say, and went through to sit down. Mrs. Harrington went in at 8 when she didn't hear the girl's step in the hall. And there she was. How very punctual of sorrow, Dolly murmured. Right on 8. It often is, Miss Marple observed. The bell must have sounded very loud. They did not press further. There was no need. In St. Mary Mead, one could collect what one needed by drifting with the current. They walked on, eyes politely averted from the windows, and circled back by the orchard where apples lay wind-fallen, their skins bruised into sweetness. At the far stile they halted, for a woman in a plain coat, face blotched with tears, had paused there with a parcel in her hands tied up in brown paper and string. "That's the maid," Dolly whispered. "Her name is Ruth. She helps out at the farm. I saw her in church last Sunday." Miss Marple smiled a little, and, because chance meetings were so very useful, adjusted her scarf in such a way that the pin refused to hold. The scarf slipped. Dolly, with a soft cry, bent to recover it, and in that agreeable muddle, two elderly women found themselves beside a tearful maid who was grateful to be required, for just a moment, to be practical. "Dear me," Miss Marple said, accepting the scarf from Ruth's hand. "At my age one is a trifle all thumbs." "Thank you, my dear. You must be having a most difficult morning." Ruth's mouth trembled. "It isn't right, miss. She looked like she were only sleeping. I never—" She bit her lip. "Beg pardon. I've got to take these things to the vicarage." She lifted the parcel as if it might explain itself. Her sketchbook and bits. Mrs. Harrington said as how they should go straight to her family. "A thoughtful instruction," Miss Marple murmured. "It is a mercy, at such times, to have something useful to do." Was Miss Denham fond of sketching interiors? "Mostly flowers and people," Ruth said, and then colored. "I mean, she liked to sit in rooms. Said people told on themselves by where they put things. She said candlelight was too arranged." Ruth's gaze flicked toward the house. "Not much of it is where it belongs." "Excuse me." They watched her go, the parcel hugged tight. Dolly turned to Miss Marple. "Too arranged." "It is a phrase I've heard before," Miss Marple said mildly. "A room that is too arranged is a room that hopes to be seen rather than lived in. It is like a lady who has had a little too much face powder and hopes one will notice only the powder." "Or a film set," Dolly ventured. "That too." By noon, Inspector Slack had arrived with a notebook and a manner that suggested the countryside would misbehave less if it would only submit to being told off. He interviewed Mr. Harrington on the terrace, within earshot of anyone who cared to loiter by the hedgerow and pretend admiration for a bumblebee. Mr. Harrington was brisk and cooperative. Mrs. Harrington's voice, when it drifted out, was the kind reserved for tragedies in other people's families. The word poison appeared again, this time carried by Slack's own lips, though coupled with warnings about speculation. He wanted lists, timings, the names of anyone who had handled the sherry decanter on the sideboard. It had been the sherry, then, or the idea of it, which made a delicate frisson pass among the listeners. Sherry was an English thing. How unkind to be betrayed by such domesticity. Miss Marple did not trouble Slack. She had learned long ago that men who carried notebooks disliked questions with the answers noted elsewhere. She contented herself with a stroll past the lane's verge, where the chalky soil threw up small telltale signs of traffic. A pair of bicycle tracks, one thin, one very slightly wobbled, pressed fresh into the dust, curving to the side gate. Someone had ridden there recently, and in haste, she thought, noting the unevenness where the pedal had scraped. She also noticed at the gate's latch a scratch that looked new. A careful house was not immune to careless hands. That afternoon, she took tea at the vicarage. Griselda Clement, pretty still and far too modern for the parish's comfort, moved about the sitting room with a kind of efficient grief, pouring tea as if it offended her not to manage something. The vicar, thoughtful and tired, thanked Miss Marple for coming in tones that meant more than the words. "Alice was a good girl," Griselda said abruptly, standing by the mantel as if the weight of conversation made the chair too soft. "Not saintly, thank heaven for that, but honest. She worked. She didn't flirt with the Harringtons, if that's what anyone's saying. She was anxious lately. That is true. She had some private worry I could not name." "Headaches?" Miss Marple asked. "Lately, yes, and she fussed with that invitation envelope. She kept it tucked in her handbag, of all foolish places, as if it were a talisman or a threat. I wanted to burn it." Miss Marple took her tea without sugar and considered the room. The clock ticked. The rainwater butt outside made a hollow drip as if the house were breathing. "Did she speak much of Candlelight Farm?" she asked. She mentioned to one person, Ruth, the room seemed too arranged. Griselda gave a helpless little laugh. She said Mrs. Harrington moved flowers that didn't need moving. She said the mantle had been dressed twice. What an odd phrase, dressed, as though it were a person. Griselda hesitated, and then added, Alice said she liked the apples in the orchard better. They were honest. Apples rarely pretend, Miss Marple agreed. She glanced down at the tea tray, at the neat triangle of lemon sandwiches, at the sugar tongs aligned exactly. Griselda did not usually align things. My dear, she said softly, I will not trouble you with questions just now, but if you should recall anything small, anything awkward or misplaced, do tell me. Human beings are so careless where they have been careful too long. After tea, when she stepped back into the lane's quiet, Miss Marple paused by the vicarage wall. A sparrow shot out from the ivy with a dry, surprised whisper of wings. She watched it go, and thought of a girl who had looked dreadfully at an envelope, and of a drawing room twice arranged, and of bicycle tracks in chalk. She did not know yet how these threads would knot, but she knew the knot existed. Somewhere between 8 o'clock and the sound of the dinner bell, someone had tugged it tight. The following morning brought mist that clung low to the hedgerows, softening the world to pale grey edges. St. Mary Mead, however, was anything but subdued. Its inhabitants bustled between cottages under the pretext of errands, each trip a pretext for acquiring some new morsel about Candlelight Farm. By 9 o'clock, theories multiplied faster than rabbits. An American quarrel, a jealous village girl, a tragic accident. None of it, Miss Marple thought, bore the texture of truth. True happenings were quieter, less embroidered. They arrived, not with trumpet and drum, but like the creeping damp one noticed only when the walls were stained. At her breakfast table, she unfolded the newspaper with a deliberate calm that fooled no one, least of all herself. The death had already made the local column, tragic incident at Candlelight Farm, a few spare lines about a visiting artist, an unfortunate collapse, and the expected cooperation of the household. No mention of poison, of course. Such things waited for confirmation. Still, she noted the phrasing, no suspicious circumstances are believed to be involved. That, she reflected, was precisely the sort of assurance that preceded suspicion. A light rap at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was young Raymond West, her nephew, his arms filled with books and the faint self-satisfaction of a man accustomed to being clever in London. Aunt Jane, he greeted, brushing damp from his coat. I came down for quiet, but the village seems in full cry. Something about a girl at Candlelight Farm? Miss Marple poured tea for him. Yes, dear. Miss Alice Denham, a gentle soul. She won a raffle to dine there, poor thing, and never came back alive. Raymond raised his brows. Good heavens, are people whispering murder already? People always whisper murder, she said mildly. It's simply that most of the time they whisper it about the wrong person. She took a thoughtful sip of tea. You might find Candlelight Farm interesting, Raymond. I understand they are planning a film. You like modern things. Raymond smiled. Ah, yes, the Harringtons. Americans, aren't they? I met him briefly at the fete. Seemed the sort who wants to turn everything into a production. I can imagine the village being a perfect setting for his lens. Quaint cottages and all that. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Yes. People often forget that quaintness looks different from the inside. I should like to call at the farm this morning to convey condolences naturally. Raymond looked at her with amused resignation. Naturally. And may I guess you'd prefer not to arrive unaccompanied, lest your presence seem pointed? My dear boy, you read my thoughts. Bring your charm, I shall bring the sponge cake. When they reached Candlelight Farm an hour later, the mist had lifted, revealing the house in its too bright paint and its carefully composed charm. The air smelled faintly of varnish and something sharper. New polish, perhaps. A maid answered, pale and nervous. Mrs. Harrington received them in the drawing-room, her dark hair neatly arranged, her composure brittle as glass. "How kind of you to come," she said, clasping Miss Marple's hands. "It's all been dreadful. So sudden. The doctor says it was heart failure, but she was so young. I can't think how it happened." Miss Marple expressed her sympathy in a tone of gentle gravity. Her eyes wandered discreetly across the room. The furniture had been rearranged since the fete, though not convincingly. The chairs stood too symmetrically, the flowers on the mantel, roses, already fading, looked hastily chosen. The turquoise walls glowed unnaturally beneath the window light, almost theatrical. Mr. Harrington entered as they sat down. He was impeccably dressed, though his expression bore the stiff unease of a man rehearsing grief rather than feeling it. "Inspector Slack tells me this is routine," he said, addressing Raymond more than Miss Marple. "But it's damned unpleasant. That poor girl barely touched her sherry." "She was unwell, I understand?" Miss Marple asked, her tone innocent. "So they say." Mrs. Harrington folded her hands too tightly in her lap. "She seemed nervous. I offered her a seat, and when I returned with the glass of water, well, she was slumped over, just like that." Her voice trembled slightly, a controlled performance. Miss Marple murmured a soothing phrase, but her eyes had fixed briefly upon the small writing desk at the far wall. A single envelope lay there, cream-colored and unsealed. Something in its placement, precisely angled, conspicuous, felt wrong. People who grieved did not tidy desks before the police arrived. Mr. Harrington followed her gaze. "Oh, that's something of Alice's, I believe. The inspector asked us not to touch it." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite right. It is always best to leave things as they are. One never knows what small matters may prove important later." After tea, unpleasantly strong, with a faint metallic tang, Miss Marple took her leave. Outside, she drew a long breath, as though shaking off the house's peculiar air. "My dear Raymond," she said softly, "do you recall the color of those roses on the mantel?" He frowned. "Yellow. Why?" "Because I saw the same arrangement, identical, down to the chipped vase, on the sideboard by the hall. I think Mrs. Harrington replaced the flowers in the drawing room this morning. Perhaps she thought them too bright, or perhaps she thought they smelled too much of something else." Raymond looked puzzled. "Do you mean poison?" "I mean pretense," she said. "One often covers the other." They walked slowly back toward the village, and Miss Marple stopped twice along the lane, once to note the absence of the bicycle tracks she had seen the day before, now raked over, and once to pick up a small scrap of paper lodged against the hedge. It was torn from a notebook, the edges smudged. On it was written, in a quick, nervous hand, "The key is not where he thinks." She folded it neatly and tucked it into her glove. By the afternoon, word had spread that the police had taken away several bottles from the farm and questioned both Harringtons separately. Dolly Bantry, arriving breathless for tea, was eager to report every detail. "They say it's digitalis. Haydock noticed signs at once. Can you imagine? That dreadful poison again. Every garden's got a store of it." Miss Marple stirred her cup, her eyes thoughtful. "Digitalis requires knowledge," she said, "and patience. It is not something one chooses by chance." Dolly leaned forward. "Do you think one of the Harringtons did it?" "My dear Dolly," Miss Marple said gently, "in murder, as in life, the person who seems to have everything to lose rarely has the most to gain. There's always someone smaller, quieter, standing just outside the frame." Later, as dusk settled, she sat by her window, the village muffled under evening calm. She reread the scrap of paper, the phrase looping back in her mind. "The key is not where he thinks." She looked out toward Candlelight Farm, its windows faintly lit against the trees. Somewhere within that house, someone was arranging things, too carefully, too neatly, hoping the world would not see what lay beneath the polish. Miss Marple smiled faintly, not with satisfaction, but with recognition. People were, after all, so very predictable when they tried their hardest not to be. The next day dawned clear and cold, the sort of morning when the village lanes gleamed faintly with dew, and the air felt sharper than usual. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, a letter knife in hand, though the post had brought her nothing of consequence, only an advertisement for patent liniment and a circular from the Women's Institute. Her mind, however, was not on correspondence. It lingered on the yellow roses at Candlelight Farm, the phrase "the key is not where he thinks," and the faint, metallic taste of tea that had left a curious aftertaste on her tongue. At 9:30, there came another knock at the door. This time it was Inspector Slack, looking brisk and slightly disheveled, as though he had been out since dawn. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said with a mix of respect and restraint. "I'm sure you've heard by now. The autopsy confirmed digitalis poisoning, enough to stop a healthy heart in minutes." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Oh dear, such an unpleasant way to die, and so easy to mistake for illness, too. A quiet poison, I suppose one might say." "Quiet, yes, and deliberate," Slack said grimly. "But the trouble is, it's everywhere. Half the gardens in England are full of foxglove. Could have come from anywhere. Still, we've narrowed down the opportunity." The girl was alone in that room for perhaps 5 minutes before the Harrington woman went in and found her. The glass of water was by her side. "We found digitalis residue in it. Now Mrs. Harrington swears she only poured the water from a jug on the sideboard." "Water?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "How very old-fashioned. Not tea, not sherry. It does sound more like care than malice, doesn't it?" Slack eyed her warily. "You're thinking something, Miss Marple. I can see it. But I'll remind you, this isn't one of your parish puzzles. Americans aren't the sentimental sort." "Indeed," she agreed mildly, "though people are much the same everywhere, once you remove the varnish." He sighed. "We've also found this." He reached into his coat and produced a folded note in a plastic sleeve. Miss Marple's heart gave the smallest leap. It was identical to the scrap she had found in the hedge. The same hurried scrawl, though the words differed slightly. "He doesn't know, not yet." "Where did that come from?" she asked. "From the drawer of that little desk in the drawing room, the one with the envelope. Seems Miss Denham was in the habit of jotting things down. The vicar confirmed her handwriting. We're checking for more." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "2 notes, both about someone's ignorance. It suggests, doesn't it, that she had discovered something, but not whom it concerned." Slack gave a short nod. "Possibly. Or it's nothing at all. She could have been writing about art, or, well, women do write notes about the oddest things. Still, it fits the picture. She knew something, and it got her killed." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone as light as the steam curling from her teacup. "But if she were truly frightened, why go to the dinner at all? One does not accept an invitation from the devil to confirm he exists." Slack frowned. "Because she had no choice. Maybe she wanted to confront someone, or maybe she trusted the wrong person. Anyway, we're keeping a close eye on both Harringtons. The husband had a business partner once who died suddenly. Cardiac arrest, so they said. The Americans are full of coincidences." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, but English villages are fuller." After the inspector left, she sat still for a long while, the house quiet around her. The ticking clock seemed almost conspiratorial. She reached into her knitting basket, withdrew the folded scrap she had found, and laid it beside the inspector's note in her mind's eye. "The key is not where he thinks. He doesn't know. Not yet." Both written in haste, both meant for no one's eyes but her own, perhaps. The sort of notes a person writes to steady herself when her thoughts run ahead of her courage. She decided then to pay another call to the vicarage. Griselda met her in the hallway, her usually lively face shadowed with fatigue. "Jane, it's ghastly. They've come twice already this morning. Poor Leonard can't bear it. He keeps saying he feels responsible. He was Alice's guardian while she was here, after all. Responsibility, Miss Marple said softly. It can be such a heavy word. Tell me, my dear, did Alice ever keep a key? A key? Griselda frowned. To the church hall, perhaps, or her little case. Oh, yes, I remember now. She carried one on a bit of blue ribbon round her wrist. I thought it quite childish, but she said she liked to keep it near. She called it her reminder. I assumed it opened her paint box or a cupboard. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. And was the key found after her death? No, they didn't mention it. Why, do you think it matters? I think, Miss Marple said, rising with a gentle finality, that things one keeps close are often the things others overlook, and people who move furniture rarely think to move drawers. That afternoon she walked again to Candlelight Farm, ostensibly to deliver a jar of marmalade. Ruth, the maid, opened the door, looking anxious. Oh, Miss Marple, Mrs. Harrington isn't in. Gone into Much Benham for shopping. How industrious, Miss Marple said kindly. No matter, dear. I'll just leave this in the kitchen. I do admire your roses, by the way. Ruth hesitated, then lowered her voice. It's strange, miss. Mrs. Harrington told me to throw out all the flowers this morning, but when I went to do it, she stopped me. Said she'd changed her mind. Only one vase was already gone. The yellow roses from the drawing room. Indeed. Perhaps they'd wilted. They hadn't, miss. Fresh as new. I'd cut them myself. When Ruth turned away, Miss Marple's sharp eyes swept the hallway. A faint trace of crushed petals lingered near the skirting board. She bent, as if adjusting her shoe, and saw a sliver of something caught between floorboards, a torn piece of ribbon, blue as cornflowers. She left it where it lay. Better to let the truth stay hidden a little longer, until the person who thought it lost began to act as though it was safe. By evening, the village was awash in speculation once more. But Miss Marple, sitting by her fire, felt the faint tremor of the pattern beginning to emerge. Somewhere between the missing key, the rearranged flowers, and the notes about ignorance, there was a line to be drawn, a line that led not to the glamorous Americans, but to someone much closer, much quieter, someone who had thought themselves unseen. She smiled faintly at the firelight. People, she murmured, are always rearranging their lives to look innocent. But the truth, oh, the truth never quite stays where you put it. The following morning broke with a softness that belied the tension stirring beneath St. Mary Mead's tranquil surface. The mist had returned, curling low over the hedgerows and turning Candlelight Farm into a silhouette of shadow and stillness. To anyone passing along the lane, it might have appeared peaceful, a country home steeped in quiet. Yet to Miss Marple, who regarded the world not for its appearances but its habits, the house seemed far too still. When people were frightened, they either spoke too much or said nothing at all. Silence, she knew, could be the loudest noise of all. She sat knitting by the window, her mind sorting through the threads of the previous days. The missing blue ribbon from Alice Denham's wrist, the rearranged flowers, the note about the key, all fragments, each unremarkable alone. But together they began to suggest a pattern, like a sampler half complete. She had once remarked, in another sad affair, that evil often revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in the small things people tried to keep tidy. At 10 o'clock, Inspector Slack's motor car rumbled up the lane again, scattering a pair of hens that had wandered too far. Miss Marple watched as he strode to the vicarage, notebook already in hand, his manner brisk but uncertain. He stayed some time, and when he left, his frown was deeper. 10 minutes later, there was a knock on Miss Marple's door. "Morning again, Miss Marple," Slack said, removing his hat. "I've just come from the vicarage. Seems our Miss Denham had a bit more to her story than we knew. Reverend Clement found this." He held up a small brown envelope, sealed with wax. It was tucked behind a prayer book in her desk at the vestry. addressed to Mrs. Harrington. The vicar hadn't opened it, said it felt improper, but he thought I should see it. Miss Marple took the envelope delicately, studying the neat, careful handwriting. How curious. She was evidently preparing to send it, not hide it. What does it contain? Half a confession, half a warning. Slack opened his notebook. She writes that she's discovered something at Candlelight Farm, something about a theft. Says she can't keep silent, even if he finds out. She doesn't name anyone, but she says she's hidden the key to the truth somewhere safe. And that's all? Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. Hidden it. Not lost, then. And written to Mrs. Harrington, of all people. How very interesting. Interesting or not, it doesn't help me much, Slack said. We've searched the place from cellar to roof. No key, no locket fits. Just that note of hers, and a room that still smells faintly of polish. He gave a short, exasperated laugh. I'd almost believe the girl poisoned herself, except that she had no reason to. She'd been planning to leave for London next week. New art position or something. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People rarely poison themselves when they've plans for the future, though they sometimes die because they know someone else's. Slack shook his head. You and your riddles. Anyway, the Harringtons are leaving for London tomorrow. Say they can't stand the gossip. I'd prefer they stay close, but there's nothing to hold them on paper. On paper, Miss Marple echoed thoughtfully. That's the very phrase, Inspector. But sometimes the truth prefers to live off the page. When he left, she sat very still. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap. She thought again of Ruth, the maid, of her frightened eyes and her talk of the roses. Flowers changed nothing, of course, but the vases that held them sometimes did. People hid things in the oddest places, often choosing the obvious precisely because no one ever looked there twice. By afternoon, she had donned her hat and set out under the pretense of delivering a pot of honey to the vicarage. But halfway there, she turned up the path to Candlelight Farm instead. Ruth answered the door, wringing her hands in her apron. Oh, Miss Marple, they said you might call. Mrs. Harrington's gone into the village, shopping again, but Mr. Harrington's in the study. Shall I fetch him? That won't be necessary, dear, Miss Marple said kindly. It's you I came to see. I wondered if you'd tell me something. When Mrs. Harrington asked you to throw away the flowers, did she seem upset or afraid? Ruth hesitated. Both, I'd say. She cried a bit, though she tried to hide it. Then she said something funny. Said, we all have to tidy up, don't we? She made me promise not to mention it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People do like things tidy. It gives them the feeling nothing dreadful can creep in. Tell me, my dear, were there 2 vases in that room? Yes, miss. The roses on the mantel and another by the window. But the one by the window's gone missing. I thought perhaps Mrs. Harrington took it upstairs. I shouldn't think so, Miss Marple murmured. One rarely carries reminders of guilt to bed. She thanked Ruth, then asked, in the most casual way, whether she might have a look round the garden. The bees, she said, were thriving this year, and she wished to see if Candlelight Farm's hives fared as well. Ruth, flattered by the interest, led her through the orchard. The ground was damp with dew, the grass bending underfoot. Near the edge of the orchard, where a narrow path led toward the gate, Miss Marple stopped. Something glinted faintly among the leaves. She bent, and there, half buried in the soil, was a small brass key, tarnished but unmistakably tied with a piece of frayed blue ribbon. She did not pick it up. Instead, she smiled quietly to herself. The wind rustled the branches overhead, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. When she returned to her cottage, she wrote a short note to Inspector Slack, sealed it, and placed it beside her teapot for the morning post. Then she sat back and regarded the fire. It was not yet time to act. The truth, she felt, was like dough. It needed proving before it would rise. But she knew now that Alice Denham had found something worth dying for. Not love, not jealousy, not even betrayal. Something simpler and far older. Theft, perhaps, or deceit wrapped in a charitable smile. She leaned forward, stirring the embers. "Oh, poor child," she murmured. "You thought the truth could be hidden by a key. But it's always people who keep the doors locked, never the locks themselves." Outside, the last of the mist drifted away, and Candlelight Farm stood clear in the moonlight, beautiful, composed, and far too clean. The following day began with a light drizzle that settled over the village like a veil, blurring rooftops and muting the chiming of the church bell. Miss Marple sat quietly by her window, watching droplets slide down the glass, her knitting untouched. The brass key in the orchard still occupied her mind. She had not retrieved it. There are times, she knew, when it is wiser to let a secret lie untouched until the person who buried it grows restless and attempts to move it. Guilt, she often reflected, was far less patient than innocence. At 8:30, a knock sounded, sharp and insistent. When she opened the door, Inspector Slack stood there, hat dripping, his expression taut. "Morning, Miss Marple. I got your note. You said I should come before the Harringtons left. What's all this about a key?" She smiled mildly. "Ah, yes. I do apologize for being vague. I merely suggested that something lost might soon be found if one waited long enough." He frowned, unimpressed. "You've a gift for riddles, ma'am, but I'm not in the mood. They're leaving for London in an hour. If you know something that can stop them, I'd like to hear it plain." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "If you were to search the orchard again, Inspector, just near the gate, you might find an item that belonged to Miss Denham. I should not care to touch it myself, but I believe it might shed some light on what she meant by her key to the truth." Slack's eyes narrowed. "You've seen it?" "I've seen enough to know it exists," she said simply. "But if you dig it up yourself, you will also see whose hands go trembling when you do." He hesitated, then nodded curtly and turned away. Miss Marple watched from her gate as he made his way down the lane toward Candlelight Farm, his stride purposeful. The drizzle had eased, and faint sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. It was, she thought, rather poetic, light returning just as darkness began to stir. By mid-morning, word had trickled through the village that Inspector Slack and his men were once again at the farm, turning over soil in the orchard while the Harringtons looked on. Dolly Bantry arrived, half out of breath, her hat askew with excitement. "They've found something, Jane. A key. Ruth says it was buried under the apple tree near the fence. Mrs. Harrington nearly fainted when they lifted it out. Imagine her going all pale like that. The inspector's taken them both inside for questioning." Miss Marple poured her friend tea and handed her a plate of biscuits. "Dear me. How distressing. I wonder why the sight of an old key should cause such alarm." Dolly leaned forward eagerly. "They say it fits a drawer in that little writing desk, the one where the note was found. And when they opened it, Jane, there were papers. Letters from some London art dealer. Seems Miss Denham had found out the Harringtons weren't making any documentary at all. They were using the film idea as cover to sell forged paintings. Can you imagine? Americans and art forgeries." "Forgery," Miss Marple said softly. "It's a curious sort of crime, isn't it? Built entirely upon the hope that people see only what they wish to see. Yes, well, the inspector says the letters were enough to prove they had the means and motive. He thinks Miss Denham confronted them. Perhaps she threatened to expose them and they silenced her. Terrible business, Jane. I shan't sleep a wink tonight." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window. "I expect you will, Dolly. There is nothing so comforting to the conscience as believing justice has been done. But I fear Inspector Slack's theory, though tidy, is a little too symmetrical." "Tidy?" Dolly echoed. "Surely you don't mean—" "I mean," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that real guilt rarely presents itself as neatly as forged papers in a locked drawer. The trouble with tidy crimes, my dear, is that someone has usually arranged them to look that way." The afternoon dragged on under a dim, reluctant sun. By 4 o'clock, the inspector returned, looking grim. He declined tea, which Miss Marple took as a sign that the case was going too easily for his liking. "We've arrested Mr. Harrington," he said flatly. "The letters, the motive, it all fits. He swears his wife knew nothing. She's in quite a state." Miss Marple studied him quietly. "Do you truly believe Mrs. Harrington capable of nothing more than tears, Inspector? She strikes me as a woman accustomed to orchestrating rather than reacting." Slack bristled. "You're suggesting she set her husband up?" "I'm suggesting she tidied up," Miss Marple said gently. "Consider it. The flowers replaced, the vase missing, a desk rearranged, her insistence that the girl had fainted rather than choked or gasped. It takes presence of mind to curate a tragedy so quickly. Perhaps she wanted suspicion to rest where it seemed most fitting, on the man with the questionable past." Slack stared at her. "If you're right, then the letters could have been planted," she finished. "They were in a locked drawer opened by a key Miss Denham supposedly hid, yet Mrs. Harrington nearly fainted before anyone mentioned where it was found. She knew what they would uncover. That kind of foreknowledge," she said softly, "does not come from innocence." He looked unsettled but unconvinced. "I'll see to it she's questioned again. Still, the man fits the pattern. People like her don't poison guests at tea." "Oh, they do, Inspector," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "They simply call it charity." After he left, evening descended with quiet certainty. The rain returned, tapping against the windows like cautious fingers. Miss Marple sat in her chair, her knitting finally resumed, though her thoughts were far from her needles. She imagined Mrs. Harrington in that turquoise drawing room, her calm voice explaining, her eyes bright with controlled sorrow. People like that didn't panic. They calculated. And then there was Ruth, the maid, loyal but frightened. Miss Marple recalled how the girl had said Mrs. Harrington cried that morning about tidying up. Tears are often the last tools of deception, she thought. They cleanse the stage before the curtain rises on another act. As she wound the last strand of wool around her needle, she murmured to herself, "Yes, Mrs. Harrington, you've arranged it all quite beautifully. But beauty, like guilt, doesn't fade quietly. It leaves a stain if one knows where to look." And she knew exactly where she would look next. The missing vase. The one that had vanished just before the police arrived. For flowers might wilt, but porcelain did not. And Miss Marple, who understood the small vanities of human nature as few did, suspected that the prettiest things in Candlelight Farm still had one last secret to reveal. The following morning carried with it a heavy, expectant stillness, the kind that settles over a place waiting to exhale. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from Candlelight Farm's chimney, curling against a sky washed pale with early light. From her window, Miss Marple watched the plume drift and thought how curious it was that life always tried to resume its normal rhythm, even when deceit still lingered in the air. The village, she knew, had already accepted the narrative. Mr. Harrington, the foreigner, the convenient culprit, had done the terrible thing. The case, to most minds, was closed. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the truth rarely wrapped itself so neatly. After breakfast, she tied on her hat and set out toward the village, walking briskly despite the damp chill. She passed the post office, where Mrs. Price Ridley was already recounting to anyone who would listen how these Americans had never seemed right from the start, and then the green, where two children played hopscotch, their laughter sharp and bright in the cold morning air. Life, she thought, had a cruel habit of carrying on while death still whispered. She was halfway down the lane toward Candlelight Farm when she heard quick footsteps behind her. It was Ruth, the maid, her coat buttoned askew, her face pale and anxious. "Miss Marple," she gasped. "Oh, thank heavens I found you. I didn't know what to do." "They've gone, Mrs. Harrington and the inspector. He's taken her to the station for more questions, but—" She lowered her voice. I saw her packing last night, something wrapped in cloth. I think it was the missing vase." Miss Marple stopped, turning slowly. "The vase? You're quite sure?" "Yes, miss. She said she wanted to take it to London, to have it repaired, but I saw it myself, the same pattern of roses painted on it, only the bottom was different. There was something fixed inside. I think it rattled when she moved it." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes soft with thought. "A vase that rattles. And she called it broken." "Yes, miss." Ruth looked frightened. "And I don't think the inspector believed her at all, but I'm scared she'll get away with it. She's clever, that one. She said to me, 'Some people break, Ruth, and some people survive. Remember that.'" It gave me a chill. Miss Marple touched her arm kindly. "You've done very well, my dear. I should not worry too much. People who are clever often forget that others can think too. Tell me, did she say where she meant to go in London?" Ruth nodded. "To her sister's. Somewhere near Hampstead, but, oh, miss, I think she'll destroy whatever's in that vase." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but perhaps not. Vanity, my dear Ruth, is a stronger impulse than fear. And Mrs. Harrington strikes me as a woman who cannot bear to part with beautiful things, especially if she believes they make her seem untouchable." Ruth's eyes widened. "What should I do?" "Nothing at all," Miss Marple replied, with that calm certainty that always soothed. "Leave everything to me." By mid-morning, the drizzle had thickened into a light rain. Miss Marple arrived at the station just as the inspector's car pulled in, bringing Mrs. Harrington back from questioning. The woman stepped out gracefully, her coat immaculate despite the weather, her expression composed. Slack followed behind, his jaw tight. He tipped his hat curtly when he saw Miss Marple. "She's free to go," he muttered. "No evidence to hold her. The husband's still in custody, though. We've confirmed the letters came from his typewriter." "How efficient of the letters to appear just where they should," Miss Marple said mildly. Slack scowled. "You don't think she forged them herself?" "Oh, I think she's quite capable of writing a convincing fiction," she replied. "The question, Inspector, is whether the story she told you matches the one she's been telling herself." Mrs. Harrington's gaze turned toward them, cool and assessing. "Miss Marple," she said with a faint smile, "how kind of you to come. You must think me quite the spectacle. I assure you, I'm as weary of this village melodrama as anyone." "I can quite imagine," Miss Marple said gently. "But I do wonder, my dear Mrs. Harrington, if it isn't a burden to carry so many delicate things about you, particularly that lovely vase you were repairing." For a fraction of a second, the woman's poise faltered. Just a flicker, quickly masked. "Oh, that old thing. It's worthless. I only meant to restore it for sentiment's sake." Miss Marple tilted her head. "How very touching. Though I should warn you, Inspector Slack has quite a weakness for art objects. He might wish to examine it, purely out of curiosity, of course." Slack blinked. Well, he looked from Miss Marple to Mrs. Harrington, who had gone visibly rigid. "Perhaps it wouldn't hurt," he said. "You wouldn't mind, would you, madam?" Mrs. Harrington gave a brittle laugh. "Of course not. It's at the house. Ruth can fetch it." But Miss Marple's voice, mild and precise, stopped her. "Oh, no, my dear. I think you'd prefer to bring it yourself. After all, it's fragile, isn't it? You wouldn't want anyone else's hands upon it." A moment passed, just long enough for the silence to reveal everything words could not. Then Mrs. Harrington smiled again, tight and false. "If it will satisfy you," she said softly, "then of course." They returned to Candlelight Farm together, the air inside the house thick with the faint scent of lavender and something sour beneath it. Fear, perhaps. Mrs. Harrington disappeared upstairs and returned carrying the vase, wrapped carefully in a silk scarf. It was exquisite, hand-painted, with soft roses blooming across its surface. "Do be careful," she murmured, handing it over. It's rather precious." Slack took it awkwardly, turning it in his hands. "Feels heavy," he muttered. He frowned and tapped the base with his knuckle. A dull sound met the touch, too thick for porcelain. He crouched, examining it closer, and prized gently at a hairline crack near the base. With a sharp click, a small hidden compartment came loose. Inside, folded tightly, was a letter sealed with wax, the same kind found on Alice Denham's envelope. Slack straightened, his face darkening. "Well, well, what have we here?" Mrs. Harrington's mask slipped at last. Her color drained, and her voice, when it came, was brittle as frost. It was her fault. She found out about the letters, the real ones. I only wanted to frighten her, to make her keep quiet. I didn't mean— Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but unflinching. "People rarely do, my dear, but intention seldom excuses the consequence. Poor Miss Denham only wished to make the truth tidy, as you did. The difference is, she meant to set things right, and you meant to keep them pretty." Mrs. Harrington turned away, her composure dissolving at last, and the faint clatter of rain against the window filled the room. When the inspector led her out, Miss Marple stood quietly for a long moment, gazing at the vase on the table. "Such a pity," she murmured. "Beauty, deceit, and tragedy, all in one container. It does rather make one wonder how many other households keep their secrets in porcelain." Outside, the rain eased, and the orchard glistened in the weak sunlight. Candlelight Farm stood silent again, its rooms still and too perfect, like a painting restored just enough to hide the cracks beneath. By the time evening settled over St. Mary Mead, the rain had thinned to a fine mist, and the lamps in the cottages glowed like soft, steady beacons against the grey. Miss Marple sat by her fire, teacup in hand, the embers crackling quietly. The events of the day, the confrontation, the vase, Mrs. Harrington's confession, played through her mind not as a triumph, but as a puzzle whose final pieces were still uncertain. It was all, she felt, too neat. A confession born of exhaustion rather than clarity. People who lied for years did not suddenly tell the truth in one breath. She set her cup down, eyes narrowing slightly. There had been one detail that continued to trouble her, the hidden letter inside the vase. Mrs. Harrington had said it was Alice Denham's final message, one that proved her guilt, but Miss Marple had seen the wax seal before the inspector broke it. It was clean, unmarked, without the slightest trace of dust or age. That, she thought, was peculiar for something supposedly hidden since before the murder. No, the letter had been placed there after the fact, perhaps even the very night before the discovery, and Mrs. Harrington, though culpable, had not been clever enough to stage such precision under the inspector's constant watch. Someone else had helped her, or used her. Her suspicions took firmer shape when, just after 9, there came a hesitant knock at her door. It was Ruth again, eyes red from crying. "Miss Marple," she whispered, twisting her hands together. "They've taken her away, to the county jail, but I can't rest. There's something I've not said. I lied to the inspector." Miss Marple motioned her gently toward the fire. "Sit down, my dear. Start from the beginning. Lies, in my experience, are best untangled while the truth is still warm." Ruth perched on the edge of the chair, trembling. "It wasn't Mrs. Harrington who found the vase first. It was me. The night before the police came again, I went to tidy the drawing room like she told me, and I saw the vase lying on its side by the stairs. It had cracked open at the base. Inside, there was a folded paper, but not the one the inspector found. This one was different. It had Miss Denham's name written on it, and I swear it wasn't sealed. I only read a few words, something about forgery and proof with him. Then Mrs. Harrington came in. She saw me holding it. She took it from me and told me never to mention it." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And you didn't think to tell the inspector?" Ruth shook her head miserably. "I was afraid. She said it would make me look like I'd stolen it. But Miss Marple, the paper I saw wasn't the same as what they found. It was thicker, older. The one in the vase today looked new. "I see," Miss Marple murmured. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were bright with understanding. "And this paper, the one you saw first, it mentioned proof with him. You're quite certain of that?" "Yes, miss. I remember because it sounded strange. I thought she meant Mr. Harrington, but now I don't know." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've done very well, my dear. Fear can make fools of the innocent, but courage repairs most things. There is one more matter, though. Did anyone else know about that letter?" Ruth hesitated. "Only one person. Mr. West, the writer gentleman. He came yesterday afternoon while you were all at the farm. He asked after you, and I told him about the vase, how the inspector had found a letter inside. He seemed terribly interested. Said he might write about it some day. He left not long after." For the first time that evening, Miss Marple's expression changed, her eyes sharpening with quiet alarm. "My nephew," she said softly, "is an intelligent man, but intelligence is a poor substitute for wisdom." She thanked Ruth and sent her home with a promise of discretion. As soon as the door closed, she fetched her shawl and stepped into the night. The air was cool, the mist rising from the hedges like faint breath. She followed the narrow path that led to Raymond West's lodgings near the edge of the village, her mind sorting through a growing suspicion. When she arrived, his study light was still burning. Raymond looked up from his desk as she entered, smiling sheepishly. "Aunt Jane, you'll scold me for staying up, but inspiration doesn't wait, you know. I've been sketching an outline for a story. About Candlelight Farm, naturally. What a setting, eh? Murder, deceit, a touch of scandal. I might even dedicate it to you." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet affection tinged with disappointment. "My dear boy, I fear you've been inspired a little too soon. May I see what you've written?" He laughed, waving a sheaf of papers. "It's hardly more than notes, but—" "Oh, very well. Don't be too severe." She took the pages and read silently. It was all there, the vase, the confession, even a mention of a mysterious hidden note. But one phrase caught her eye. Alice Denham's proof lay with him all along. The exact wording Ruth had described. She looked up sharply. "Raymond, where did you hear that phrase?" He blinked. "What phrase?" "Proof with him. You wrote it here." "Oh, that." He smiled faintly, though his fingers drummed on the desk. "I suppose I overheard someone say it. Perhaps the inspector." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but there was steel beneath it. "No, my dear. The inspector never knew of it. Only the person who read Miss Denham's first letter could have written those words, and that person was not Mrs. Harrington." The color drained slightly from his face. "Aunt Jane, you can't mean— Surely you don't think—" "I think," she said softly, "that someone clever enough to recognize a good story might also recognize a useful secret. You visited the farm after the police left, did you not? You saw the vase, perhaps even the letter Ruth had found. You realized what it meant, and you decided to keep it. A writer's curiosity, you'd say. But curiosity can be terribly dangerous when it concerns the dead." He rose, his voice tense. "You're wrong. I only wanted to protect you. From scandal, the letter, it accused Mrs. Harrington, yes, but it also mentioned me. She'd written about the fate, about something she'd overheard between us. If it came out, people would twist it. I had to remove it before the inspector found it. So yes, I hid it in the vase. I thought—" He broke off, breathing hard. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Miss Marple's face softened. "Ah, Raymond, the right thing is rarely the tidy thing. You've made a dreadful muddle, and a woman's guilt has been made to bear the weight of your fear." He sank into his chair, defeated. "What will you do?" "I shall do what must be done," she said quietly. "The truth, like the past, cannot be rewritten, though people are always trying." She left him then, her heart heavy but resolute. The path home was dark, the mist thickening once more. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell struck 10, solemn and slow. Miss Marple did not hurry. The final act was already unfolding, and tomorrow, when she spoke with Inspector Slack, the story would be set right, truth restored to its place, though at a cost neither fame nor fiction could redeem. Morning crept into St. Mary Mead, wrapped in mist and stillness, the kind that softens the edges of roofs and lanes, as though the village were holding its breath. Miss Marple, having slept little, sat at her breakfast table, her tea cooling beside her untouched. She was waiting, not for confirmation, but for the inevitable. Truth, she had learned, did not need chasing. It had a way of arriving, quietly and precisely, when people's nerves began to fray. The previous night's revelation about her nephew had left her mind troubled but clear. Raymond had not meant harm, that much she believed, but good intentions, she reflected, had filled just as many graves as malice. He had meddled where ignorance would have been safer, and now his act of concealment threatened to unbalance everything. The case, in the inspector's eyes, was closed. The villagers were content to let Mrs. Harrington bear the blame. Yet Miss Marple knew it was not over. Something still did not fit. Not in motive, not in sequence, and certainly not in truth. At 9:15, Inspector Slack appeared at her door again, his boots muddy from the early walk and his expression a mix of irritation and reluctant respect. "You've a habit, Miss Marple," he said without greeting, "of writing to me just when I think I'm finished. You said there's more to this than I've seen. I'll admit I don't like the sound of that." "Few people do, Inspector," she replied pleasantly, "especially when they believe they've solved everything." She motioned for him to sit, and he did so awkwardly, perching on the edge of the chair like a schoolboy awaiting reprimand. "Mrs. Harrington's confession is solid," he said briskly. "She admitted to giving Miss Denham the poisoned water. Her husband corroborated her temper, and the letter in the vase sealed it. The Crown will have no difficulty." Miss Marple stirred her tea, watching the faint spiral of steam. "Yes, it is all quite perfect, isn't it? And that, Inspector, is precisely what troubles me." He frowned. "You've said that before. Too tidy, too neat. But people do confess when they're cornered." "Oh, indeed," she agreed mildly. "But confessions, like flowers, must be examined for what they conceal as well as what they show. I believe Mrs. Harrington told you part of the truth, her part, but not the whole. She didn't poison Miss Denham out of fear. She did it out of protection." "Protection? For whom?" "For someone she thought she loved." Slack leaned forward. "Her husband, you mean? She said she wanted to protect him from scandal." "Not her husband." Miss Marple looked up, her eyes steady. "Her accomplice." The inspector blinked. "Accomplice? There's no one else. Unless you mean the maid, and I've already ruled her out." "No, not the maid." Miss Marple's voice softened. "The accomplice was clever, manipulative, and entirely self-serving. Someone who understood how stories capture sympathy and how to place guilt neatly where it belonged. Someone who had access to every version of the tale before it reached the police. Someone, perhaps, who fancied himself a writer." Slack's face darkened. "Your nephew." She inclined her head, her tone calm, though her chest felt tight. "I fear so. Not in the way one might imagine. He did not poison the poor girl, but he set the stage for another to do so, quite unknowingly. He became the thread that linked them all." "Go on." "Miss Denham admired Raymond. She confided in him after the fête, told him she'd discovered irregularities in the Harringtons' accounts and a cache of forged correspondence meant to swindle their investors. She'd found them while sketching at the farm, quite by accident. Raymond, ever romantic, thought her dramatizing. But she left him a note the next day, one he never mentioned to you, I think. It spoke of danger, of someone who knew she'd found the letters." Slack rubbed his chin. "You're saying she told him she was in danger and he did nothing?" He believed it an exaggeration, an artist's sensitivity. But he did something worse. When she showed him the letter implicating Mrs. Harrington, he advised her to keep it safe. He even suggested she hide it in the vase. Later, when the murder occurred, he panicked. He thought if the letter were found, it might reveal his carelessness. So he removed it before you could find it and replaced it with another, a fabrication, using lines from her own writing to make Mrs. Harrington appear fully guilty. You see, Inspector, Raymond wanted to save face, not to condemn a woman to the gallows. But once a lie begins, it does not stop where one intends. Slack stared at her, incredulous. Good God! Do you have proof of this? Miss Marple reached into her knitting basket and withdrew a folded sheet. I found this in his waste bin last night. It is a draft of the forged letter, written in his hand. He'd torn it in two, but not quite enough. The phrasing is identical to the one found in the vase. The inspector took it, his brow furrowed. So your nephew forged the letter, and Mrs. Harrington confessed under the weight of it. She confessed because she thought it the only way to protect the man who helped her hide her husband's crimes, Miss Marple said softly. It seems she and Raymond had become acquainted during his visits here. She mistook his fascination for affection. When she learned he had withheld Miss Denham's warning, she panicked. Perhaps she believed he was complicit. Perhaps she simply wished to shield him. Love, in its foolish forms, often becomes the most dangerous of poisons. Slack's voice was low. And the real cause of death? The water was poisoned, yes, but not by Mrs. Harrington. The maid's account was accurate. Miss Denham took the glass herself. I believe she mistook it for the one prepared for Mrs. Harrington, who had been suffering heart palpitations and took digitalis by prescription. A tragic accident, transformed into murder by fear and deceit. The inspector sat back, rubbing his temples. It's a tangle, that's what it is. But you're right. It fits the evidence better than anything else. We'll need to question West. Miss Marple's expression was gentle but weary. Yes, I've already sent for him. He'll be here shortly. They waited in silence, the clock ticking steadily between them. At last there was a hesitant knock, and Raymond entered, pale and drawn. His eyes flicked to his aunt, then to Slack, and he seemed to understand everything without a word. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, he said quietly. I only wanted to protect her, and you. I thought the truth would destroy us both. Miss Marple rose, her gaze tender but firm. The truth destroys nothing that deserves to stand, my dear. It merely clears the dust from what has already begun to crumble. He bowed his head, and in the heavy quiet that followed, the truth, at last, took its rightful place among them, solemn and unadorned. Outside, the mist began to lift, and the first clear light of morning spilled across the village, soft yet merciless, revealing everything that had been hidden. The hours that followed passed in a hush that seemed to envelop the whole of St. Mary Mead. Even the birds in the hedgerows sang more softly, as though they too sensed that the village had reached the end of one of its darker tales. Miss Marple, though outwardly calm, felt the weight of it, all pressing gently upon her shoulders. She had always known that truth, once uncovered, rarely came without sorrow. Still, there was a peculiar kind of melancholy in seeing it laid bare before her own family. Inspector Slack lingered long after Raymond had been escorted away to make his formal statement. His usually brusque manner had softened somewhat, the bluster replaced by something like reluctant admiration. You've done it again, Miss Marple, he said finally, standing by the hearth. Though I'll admit, this one leaves a bitter taste. I don't envy you having to face it. She folded her knitting and set it aside. There is no need for envy, Inspector. The truth does not ask for comfort, only acknowledgement. And as for bitterness, well, one cannot expect sweetness from every fruit one tends in life. Slack looked down at the papers he held. The forged letter, the draft in Raymond's hand, the statement confirming the accidental nature of Alice Denham's death. It's a strange business, he murmured. No villain, not really. Just fear, pride, and foolish love. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly, the most ordinary ingredients of tragedy. When he had gone, she sat alone for a time, listening to the faint ticking of the clock and the occasional murmur of voices outside. The news had already begun to ripple through the village. Dolly Bantry would no doubt be on her way before noon, armed with sympathy and curiosity in equal measure. Miss Marple, however, found her thoughts returning to Alice Denham, a gentle girl, keen-eyed and sincere, whose only misfortune had been to notice what others preferred to ignore. "Poor child," she whispered to the empty room. "You saw too clearly, and the world punished you for it." A soft knock broke her reverie. It was Ruth again, her expression subdued, though her hands were steady now. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "the inspector asked me to bring this. It's Miss Denham's sketchbook. They found it behind the vestry cupboard. He thought perhaps you ought to have it." Miss Marple took the book gently. Its cover was stained and frayed, but when she opened it, she found delicate pencil drawings inside, studies of the village green, the churchyard, and Candlelight Farm. On the last page, faintly smudged, was the unfinished sketch of two figures near an orchard gate. A woman bending to pick up something from the ground, and beside her, a man with his back turned, looking away toward the lane. Beneath the drawing, in small, hurried writing, were the words, "Sometimes it's the one who looks away who sees the least." Miss Marple traced the line with her fingertip, her eyes softening. "Yes, my dear," she murmured. "That is very true." When Ruth had gone, she set the sketchbook on the mantel and went out for a walk. The rain had cleared, and the air smelled of damp leaves and turned soil. She followed the familiar path toward Candlelight Farm, where the shutters were now drawn and the garden lay untended. The police had finished their work. The Americans were gone, their grand plans for English pastoral life dissolved like sugar in tea. The place looked smaller now, stripped of its pretensions. Only the orchard remained unchanged, the trees standing silent, their bare branches etched against the pale sky. She walked slowly among them, her shoes pressing into the soft ground. Here was where Alice had last walked, where the key had been hidden, where all the tangle of deceit had first begun to unravel. There was peace in it now, a somber, inevitable peace. She paused near the old apple tree, resting a gloved hand against its trunk. "So much fuss," she said quietly, "over what was in the end nothing more than human nature doing its usual mischief." Behind her, a voice called softly, "Aunt Jane." Raymond stood a few paces away, pale but composed. The inspector had released him for the time being at least. He had agreed to cooperate fully. He looked tired, older somehow, and far humbler than he had been when he first arrived with his notebooks and bright ideas. "I had to come," he said quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I couldn't leave without seeing you." Miss Marple turned, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she sighed, and a faint, wistful smile touched her lips. "Forgiveness is rather like sunlight, my dear. It appears whether one deserves it or not. But I am glad you came. It's never wise to leave things unsaid." He stepped closer, his voice low. "I was foolish. I thought I could control the story, make it fit. You've always said truth and fiction are cousins, but I suppose I confused which one was meant for living and which for writing." She regarded him with quiet affection. "We all make that mistake sooner or later. But remember, Raymond, a story told too perfectly ceases to be true. Life is a messier and kinder in its way." He nodded, and for a while they stood together, the silence between them no longer sharp but healing. At last, Miss Marple turned back toward the village. "Come along," she said softly. "There's a train at 3. You'll go back to London, I think. Write something better, not about what happened, but about what it means. That, my dear, is what stories are for." He managed a faint smile. "And you? What will you do now?" "Oh, the usual," she said lightly. "The roses need pruning, and I dare say the vicar's wife will want help reorganizing the church bazaar." She glanced back once at the farm, its windows reflecting the pale sunlight. Life, after all, doesn't stop for murder. It simply adjusts its hat and carries on. By afternoon, the mist had burned away entirely. The village green was alive again with chatter, the butcher's boy whistling as he cycled past, children playing at a hopscotch, the faint chime of the church clock marking the hour. Miss Marple walked home with her steady, unhurried steps, her figure small but certain against the expanse of the lane. Inside her cottage, she placed Alice Denham's sketchbook on the shelf beside her teacups, its spine nestled neatly between a gardening manual and a worn Bible. Then she lit the fire and sat once more by the window, her knitting in her lap, her gaze thoughtful but serene. Outside, the last light of day touched the rooftops, gilding the village in soft gold. The case at Candlelight Farm had ended, though its echoes would linger in whispers and knowing glances for weeks to come. But Miss Marple, as always, understood that time would smooth even this into the fabric of village life, another tale to be retold over tea, half rumor, half truth, and wholly human. And as dusk settled, she smiled faintly to herself, the needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "Ah, well," she murmured, "the world keeps teaching the same lesson, doesn't it? People are endlessly surprising, and yet they never really change." The days that followed passed with a calm so complete it seemed almost deliberate, as though St. Mary Mead itself had drawn the curtains on the affair at Candlelight Farm. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to mistake quiet for peace. The village was already knitting the story into its tapestry of half-truths and recollections, each version slightly altered, each teller confident in their accuracy. Mr. Harrington had returned to America, broken but free. Mrs. Harrington awaited trial on lesser charges, her beauty now spoken of with pity rather than envy, and young Ruth had left the farm to work for the vicarage, her loyalty rewarded with kindness instead of fear. As for Raymond West, he had gone back to London, subdued and chastened, determined to face whatever came of his mistake. Miss Marple, however, had not yet closed her mind upon the case. One small detail still troubled her: the sketchbook. It sat now upon her mantel, the pencil drawings faded at the edges, the final image of the orchard gate always catching her eye. There had been something faintly unfinished in the way Alice Denham had drawn the man's turned back, as though she had not meant to depict Mr. Harrington at all. One afternoon, while the light slanted golden through her lace curtains, she opened the book again and studied it anew. And then, quite suddenly, she saw it, the set of the shoulders, the posture, familiar, unmistakable. It was Raymond. The discovery brought no shock, only quiet confirmation. Alice must have drawn it on the day of her death, perhaps moments before leaving for Candlelight Farm. She had known Raymond was somehow involved, knew he had advised her to hide the letter, perhaps even feared he would speak to the Harringtons, and yet she had gone to the farm regardless, trusting that decency or affection might shield her. Miss Marple closed the book with care. "Poor girl," she murmured. "You saw the truth too late, but you saw it all the same." Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the church steeple, Inspector Slack called once more. "It's over now," he said gruffly, though his tone was less certain than his words. "The Crown won't press further against your nephew. The magistrate believes it an error of judgment, not malice. Mrs. Harrington's been moved to hospital. She's not likely to stand trial. Seems poetic justice, if you ask me." "Poetic," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes, though one should never trust poetry, to be fair. It's far too fond of tragedy." Slack hesitated, then looked at her with an expression that was almost deferential. "You always see more than we do, don't you? I used to think it was guesswork, but now I reckon it's something else. Observation, maybe. Human nature, you call it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, it's much simpler than that, Inspector. I just remember things people prefer to forget. Human behavior is dreadfully consistent, you know. The setting may change, but the players rarely do. After he had gone, she sat for a long time by the hearth, the fire crackling gently. The village outside was settling into dusk, the familiar sounds of shutters closing and kettles boiling carrying on the air. The world, she reflected, was already mending itself. Flowers would bloom again in the orchard, new tenants would take the farm, and in time, Candlelight would be only a name in whispered recollection. Yet something of Alice Denham's quiet courage lingered, a soft echo of conscience in a place that so often forgot its better instincts. When Raymond's letter arrived a fortnight later, its tone was humble and spare. He wrote that he had confessed everything to his publisher and withdrawn from his upcoming work. "I think I understand now," he said, "that the truth is not a thing one edits. I was trying to write life as if it were fiction, clean, symmetrical, meaningful, but it isn't, is it? Life stumbles, contradicts itself, forgives, and carries on. You taught me that, though I wish I hadn't forced the lesson." Miss Marple folded the letter with care and placed it beside the sketchbook. Her eyes softened with a mixture of sadness and affection. "He'll do better next time," she murmured. "We all must." That evening she took a slow walk through the village. The air was crisp, the last traces of autumn clinging to the hedgerows. Passing the churchyard, she paused by the gate and looked toward Candlelight Farm, its silhouette faint against the fading sky. It stood silent now, its windows dark, but the shape of it remained beautiful in the gloaming, a reminder, perhaps, that even places touched by tragedy can recover their stillness. A breeze stirred the fallen leaves at her feet, and she thought again of Alice Denham, the young artist whose curiosity had uncovered what deceit had buried. "You are not so very different from me, my dear," she said softly. "You watched people, you listened, and you tried to make sense of them. You just didn't have quite enough time." As she turned for home, the church bell tolled 7, and the familiar comfort of St. Mary Mead enfolded her once more, the glow of lamps through curtains, the murmur of laughter from the inn, the faint scent of wood smoke on the air. All the elements of village life, unaltered, eternal. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple set the kettle on the stove and took up her knitting. The rhythmic click of the needle steadied her, the firelight flickering softly against her face. There would always be another mystery, she thought, some small oddity of human nature, some contradiction to be unraveled. But for now, peace was enough. As the clock struck the hour, she looked out toward the village green, where the first stars had begun to appear. "The world does mend itself," she said quietly. "Not because it deserves to, but because it must." And with that, she smiled, the serene, knowing smile of a woman who understood the frailty and resilience of the human heart, and returned to her knitting, while the soft hum of St. Mary Mead carried on outside, unchanged and eternal.